Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome to part 0 of our tutorial series featuring Cao Cao. In this part, we'll be covering the setup and the options you have before you jump into a game. There will be no gameplay, but this is a rather short tutorial for those who are new to the game, and we'll also be showing some menu options for those who might have been playing for a while but never bothered to check the options menu. So before you eagerly enter into a new campaign, under Extras on the main menu, you can take a look at the options. And within options, we have graphics, audio, control, camera, interface, and device. Graphic is where you will set most of your game quality depending on your graphic card and CPU. And if you have the Blood DLC, Blood effect can be activated here. And within the events menu, you can alter other details if you want to fine-tune your setup. But most importantly, within this menu, you have the option of unit size. Now, unit size is dictating how many units you have per retinue of troops. So on the standard setting or large, you get 120 infantry per group and 30 cavalry per group. You can double this if you go all the way up to extreme, or you can make it smaller. Now this will depend on how powerful your system is, and I typically play on large, not because the system can't handle it, but just because it's a good neutral point. Similar reason why I play with no mods, and also there are certain units that do not scale with the unit size. For example, siege weapons. Siege weapons will always remain at 4 siege weapons. So for that reason, I think the default setting is probably the most balanced as well. And if you do have the Blood DLC, you also have the option to set how much blood and dismemberment you'll see in the game. And I have it set on 25-25. It's a pretty decent setting in my opinion. I tested this out when it first came out. Basically, if you have 100, your character is going to look like a hungry vampire who just went to town, and everything will be covered in blood, and it's actually quite hard to play. So it's probably best to tone it down a bit. You can even go less than 25%. Blood will be pretty noticeable, even when you have 10% on. So that's pretty much the settings. If you want to change any of these, feel free. I'm also recording, so I turned quite a few things down. And if you have no clue what's each of these are, they will describe it a little bit for you of what they're used. But if you're not, well versed in computer speak, just click benchmark, and the game will automatically set your settings according to how much your system can handle, as it will put you through a little test demo through the game to see what frame rates you get with each setting, and that's probably the easiest way to get your settings right. And if things aren't looking as good, or if you're getting lags, just tone things down a bit and you'll still be able to enjoy the game. Now, audio is pretty straightforward. I have certain things set to not compete with my voice, but a few other key things are subtitles, and if you want Chinese audio instead of the English one in the game. So they have a Chinese voiceover for all the speech, since I am Chinese and I can understand it, and it feels more authentic to me to play a Three Kingdoms game with Chinese audio. I have them checked, and that's pretty much what you get in audio. Control is a great place for you to customize control, as well as to check out what controls are in the game. We'll be talking about most of these as we play, since this is a tutorial let's play, so we're not going to spend too much time on this right now. Camera settings are pretty standard. I don't think I change anything. There might be a few things you might want to change. If you're playing Windows mode, maybe you want to lock cursor within your windows, or maybe the whole reason why you're playing Windows mode is so you can bring your cursor out to a second screen. And inside interface, we have a couple more interesting choices, namely the unit card art. So in Three Kingdoms, there's 2 variations. I typically use the basic version, which is a minimalist style, no faces, no features, just some splash of color to showcase what the unit type is, the weapon, and that's basically it. You can go with the more traditional Total War unit cards in the alternative version, where it shows the whole unit in a with faces and all, but I typically like the minimalist look, so I went with basic pretty much for all my campaign. You can also alter the coloring scheme in the game. I'm pretty used to default setting, so I'm going to keep it here. Within the battle interface, you can also set things like default to run. One thing I have turned off is I have turned off default skirmish mode. This is for your range unit. On skirmish mode, if the enemy are charging at your range unit, they will retreat instead of fire. So I have turned this off because I typically want them to do as much damage as possible, and I will be in charge of protecting them so they don't get charged at. As for guard mode, this is quite useful, but the problem is the guard mode in the game doesn't work as intended, or it doesn't work as well. Basically, the idea of guard mode is as you target an enemy with your unit, once that unit starts routing, you will stand guard where you stand. You will not chase endlessly on the edge of the map. So it's a decent setting. I think you can definitely consider checking this. It doesn't change your gameplay as much, but I pretty much have it off. Projectile trails are if you want to see the arrow trails or the trebuchet shot trails. Since I prefer to visually see where they're going, I have it on, but some people who prefer immersion don't like seeing the arrow trails, and you can turn that off. And as well as certain other interface in the battle, like the drag out lines when you move your units. And you can also have unit category sorting, and this will sort the units by type in a battle instead of by the retinue or the general they belong to. And if you're new to the game, you might not know what this is talking about, but we'll showcase this. And there's other ways around this. You can easily group units by type within the game, and that will basically achieve the same thing. And finally, there's the Vice menu. If you're completely new to the game, your setting is going to be widely different, as they will recommend you to have a certain level of a Vice, as they will basically be an in-game tutorial. But since you're watching this one, perhaps you don't need it anymore, and you can just follow along, as I have everything turned off to none since I've been playing the game for quite some time. So I have this turned off to none. And that's pretty much it for all the extra options. Now, you'll be eager to jump into game, and that's understandable. If you have just gotten the base game, you will see a different screen than what's shown here, or perhaps you're playing on a later patch and things have gotten changed. But the general idea here is you have a timeline on the bottom featuring the DLC chapter packs. In Total War 3 Kingdoms, there are a couple different versions of DLCs. The typical one is called the chapter pack. And what it does is it creates a snapshot of a certain time or year during the Three Kingdoms conflict, and you can play as the factions that are available during those time periods based on the historical snapshot of that time. But the base game features 190. So 190 would be our default option that's available to everyone, and that's why we'll be showcasing it on 190 as well. And since Cao Cao is the first faction that popped up, and he's also the faction that ended up winning the poll that I put out for who should I feature in the tutorial, and also is deemed easy by Creative Assembly, we'll be using Cao Cao as our tutorial. And if we take a look at the map, this will show every faction that's available for play in the 190 start. Now, there's going to be a certain few factions that's not going to be on your screen if you're completely new to the game, or if you're missing certain DLCs. For example, these 4 factions down here belongs to the Furious Wild DLC. So if you don't have that, you will not be able to play as these southern tribes, as you can see them on the selection screen on your left. You also have factions like Shixie, Yanbaihu, and Taoqian, who are free LCs. So if you go to the Steam store and download these for free, you will be able to play them here. Or else, if you just open a brand new game, they will not be here on the screen. Then you have Yellow Turban factions like He Yi, Gongdu, and Huang Shao, who are part of the Yellow Turban DLC, which will also not be available to you if you don't have that one. Liu Chong is a character that's unlocked from the Mandated Heaven or the 182 campaign, so he will also be missing. And lastly, there's one character who you can unlock for free, and that is Dong Zhuo. If you are new to the game and have a completely new copy, he will not be a playable faction. But if you beat him in battle with any other character, or if you use any other character to reach the rank of king in-game, he will become unlocked and playable. So he's one of those Easter egg unlockable factions here in Total War 3 Kingdom, and he's quite fun to play. So that's something you should definitely look forward to if you're brand new to the game. He will be free for you to add if you just follow the instructions to battle him in the game map, which is actually quite hard to do, or just keep playing as the faction you start out with and reach the rank of king, and the next time you come back to the menu select, you'll see him available as one of the factions you can play as. And you can also go grab yourself the free DLCs in Taoqian, Yanbaihu, and Shixie. So aside from selecting a faction, the menu is pretty friendly now after patch 1.6.0, which is when this is being recorded, in that they have a list of recommended characters that they suggest you try out in this time frame. They have it broken down into what factions they were part of during the conflict. You have the coalition, as right now, the theme of the 190, Rise of the Warlords, is that Zhuo, the villain here, has seized the young emperor, and there's now a coalition forming to take back the emperor. And on the other side, you have the empire, which has been corrupted by Zhuo, but you still had many factions that were part of the empire, whether they are relatives to the emperor himself, or some other factions that have cozy up to the tyrant Zhuo. Now, of course, you might be wondering, if he had taken the young emperor or seized him, why are the relatives still friendly? And that is because he still didn't usurp yet. He is just a very powerful tyrant regent who has basically taken control of the court while the emperor is just a kid. So technically he hasn't betrayed the country yet, but the coalition think that it's a matter of time, so they are rallying together to dispose him, while some of the older relatives of the emperor are still waiting to take a look, and it's weird for them to betray their, young king before there's any actual usurp going on. And then you have factions like bandits, which will play quite differently and will be hard to cover in this guide, but there are also separate bandit guides on the channel for you to take a look at, as well as some let's plays for Yan Bai Hu, which will feature the bandit revamp when it first came out, so I do cover some of the new mechanic in that one. But for our purpose here, we'll be playing as one of the coalition members in Cao Cao, who is a central figure in the entire Three Kingdoms story, as he will eventually go on to find one of these kingdoms in the Kingdom of Wei, which controlled about 2/3 of China, as he competed with the Kingdom of Shuhan in the west and the Kingdom of Wu in the south. So we'll be taking us on a journey here, and the other factions are ones you're not going to see. The Southern Tribes, as I mentioned, DLC. The Yellow Turban Remnants, also DLC. The unavailable at this date are basically DLC characters who are only exist in their realm. So basically the 194 start, you'll be able to play as Sun Ce and Lu Bu. The 182 start, you'll be able to play as the Emperor himself, or Lu Zhi, or Liu Chong, which is available in multiple time slots. There are characters who exist throughout different DLCs, and there are those who are exclusive to their own DLCs. For example, all the Sima princes here are only available in the 291 8 Princes DLC. And you can also conduct your search for it by typing in the name that you want to see. And then on the right is what really pertains to us, as we can switch off the map and go back to this character screen. So Cao Cao, our main characters, in the middle, and flanking him are two noteworthy characters in Xia Houdun and Xia Houyuan, and these are his in-laws. Cao Cao's first wife, Lady Ding, had a younger sister who married Xia Houyuan, so they are kind of in-laws and related, and they came to his aid when Cao Cao was rising to become a warlord. And you'll be able to see different characters when you select different factions. But for Cao Cao here, we'll start out with two noteworthy characters, as they have unique arts. And you can see his faction specialization on the right. So Cao Cao has a special faction mechanic and a resource called credibility. And you can use this resource to do certain things. And for new players, these might sound very strange and you might not understand them. And every faction is going to have their unique thing. And we're not going to be here to cover all the uniqueness of each faction, but rather how you should approach these, using Cao Cao as a general guide. So Cao Cao here can incite proxy wars, and this is a war that you can trigger between any two factions on the map, assuming you have enough credibility and enough diplomatic power to ask them to attack each other. And this could involve yourself as well. So you're basically setting up a war between A and B, where you can also be part of the A and B as well. You can also use this to improve diplomatic ties or influence diplomatic ties, as you can make it better or worse. And we'll showcase all of this once we get into game. And credibility is a resource that will automatically increase each turn, so it's quite friendly to the player. You don't have to do too much to manage it, and that's why Cao Cao is considered an easy faction, even though his starting situation, if you take a look on the map, is quite difficult because you're in the center of the map, surrounded by different factions who are all very powerful, because these are all the playable factions, so they tend to be stronger, and there's also map filled with factions that are not playable but still there to interact with you. And the only places that are empty on the map are these darker shaded regions like here, which are deserted in the beginning and can be colonized, or here. But aside from that, everything else has a faction inside of it. And you also can see your unique features in terms of units and buildings. Cao Cao has quite interesting, unique abilities in terms of buildings. His units are pretty plain. There are 2 shock cavalry units. They do stand out. They recently got a buff in the latest patch, so that's another thing that I have to mention here. This guide will be good for everything on 1.6 in terms of patch, but I will try not to showcase it too patch dependent and try to generalize a lot of the concept so you can adapt your strategies in future patch notes. And what we have here is a tiger and leopard cavalry, which will become available for all characters rank 3 or higher. That's actually quite important because all the characters in the game have separate classes, and each class can only recruit certain types of unit unless you have a unit here like this, which is a faction unique unit that will be shared with all the classes, which is actually quite strong, as you can customize your armies with many more options with units like this. But the requirement here is that your character must have rank 3 or higher, so they must be level 3 or higher to recruit this one. And these are all-rounder shock cavalry units that have high defense against missile, which is something that's not common for shock cavalry, as shock cavalry typically do not carry shields and thus are vulnerable to enemy range damage. But in the case of tiger and leopard, as you can see from the art, they carry a little shield on them, so that helps protect them against missile. They are low damage, as in they have low melee attack, but the blunt of the cavalry damage will be the charge itself. So they are actually pretty high damage dealers, but you don't want them to be stuck within an enemy army fighting their way out, as they do have lower damage in that aspect. You want them to be flanking, charging through the enemy lines, regrouping and charging again. So it depends on how you want to use your special unique unit or any of your units in the game, and we'll talk about these once we do some guides for the battle. And then the other variation of your special unit is an upgraded version called the Heavy Tiger and Leopard Cavalry, and these are available at rank 6 or higher. And clearly, just from the name itself, they're just going to have better stats compared to the rank 3 version. So these two are your faction unique units. And in terms of unique buildings, we have something called the Farming Garrison, which is an alternative building for the typical farmland settlements on the map. We'll take a look at these when we are in the game, as we can explain them better there. But you can see here they improve extra food, minus military district costs, so they save you money building military buildings, and they increase your replenishment rate. A very useful building, and there's a couple variation of this depending on what resources available in the game. And then finally we have another special building. This one's called the Tun Tian Conscription, and this is a conscription building that's a replacement for the typical vanilla conscription building that's available to all factions. This one will improve your starting rank for new recruits, will increase the movement of your armies within that commandery. And for those of you who are coming into Three Kingdoms from other Total War game or just brand new to the game, commandery is just the Chinese term used for provinces. They were called commanderies during this time as multiple commanderies made up of a province. Province was a little bit bigger in the Han Dynasty, so the term is basically province into commanderies into counties, versus the typical Total War game, which probably just have counties or smaller minor settlements into a province. So commandery here would be akin to a province in most other Total War games. And what we have here is also seasonal retinue deployment, which we'll talk about what that is in the game, food from farming, and minus agricultural garrison cost, and minus population growth. So all the green marks are benefits and all the red marks are penalties. So it does punish your population growth a little bit, which we'll also talk about the effect of that, but a lot of pluses here with all the various green marks. Now the one minus green means you're reducing the cost, which is making that building cheaper, which is a benefit for you. And we already talked about the noteworthy characters. And we can also take a look at the character itself, and what this means is the bonus on Cao Cao himself, your faction leader. So first, every character in the game starts out with 3 traits and can increase up to a total of 8. And what you have here are basically traits with different bonuses for the character that could impact his army, his retinue, or even the whole faction. So what we have here is Dutiful, which will give him 8 authority points. That is one of the 5 stats in the game, which we'll also take a look at once we get into game. We'll take a look at these once we jump in, but right now just a quick overview of what you can see on the character tab. You can see his 3 traits and what bonuses they have. You can see what class of character Cao Cao is. He is a commander. We talked about there are different classes, and they'll talk about generically what commanders are meant to do, as well as some faction-wide bonuses that are on his own character. In this case, we have minus 25% redeployment cost, minus 15% recruitment cost for cavalry, and plus 2 available spy positions. And then a little character background about his history, which we'll talk about in game as well. And aside from all this, we still have an option menu where we can set our campaign difficulty. I'll be showcasing this on Legendary. I'll talk about what the difference are as you change these difficulties once we jump into the game. The big threshold is beyond hard. But once you go past hard into very hard and legendary, you'll see the most difference, namely in battle difficulty. You can alter these separately. You don't have to play on Legendary. You can do Legendary hard. You can play around with the settings you want. But here, the main difference is if you are on Legendary difficulty, Battle Realism mode will automatically be checked. And what this does is your battles will not have a visible minimap or tactical map. You'll also not be able to pause the battle at any time. And your camera is always restricted to a local area around your unit. So you can't extend the camera to look at a faraway place because realistically your units haven't been there, so you can't see that area as well. That has to do with the battle difficulty. And battle difficulty revolves around everything that happens on the battle map. That is, once you jump into a fight. On the campaign map or the grand strategy overview, you have a different setting of difficulty, and this has to do with how strong AI factions are in terms of how much bonus they get against you. On Legendary, you have certain penalties that are working against you for your own faction in terms of satisfaction, and you also have AI bonuses in that they get cheaper buildings, cheaper armies, more income, making things much more difficult for you. For battle difficulties, the threshold is hard because below hard, the AI logic for the fight is quite different. For example, the ranged units will shoot at your generals on hard or below because they feel like they can hit you even though you are a single entity unit, meaning that you will actually be very good at dodging enemy range, and if they waste their ammo on you, you can potentially cheese out all their ammo before your main army moves up, and by the time they have to fight your main army, they'll be out of ammo. So to prevent that, you jump into very hard or legendary, and the ranged units will not shoot at your generals unless you have no other units and you just have your generals. Then they will shoot at you, obviously. But then there's another problem with cheesing the game, in that since they will never shoot at you, if you run your generals at the enemy range, all they can do is run away from you or choose to enter into melee mode with you. But since skirmish mode is pretty much always auto set for AI units, they will just run away from you and get chased down by your general on a horse. So that renders some of the ranged units less effective in a sense on Legendary and very hard. But given that we're playing against the AI in a game like this, there's always going to be ways to work around certain settings. But I still think logically it makes more sense for them to not waste the ammo on the general, since it does do very little damage on the generals. It's much better to shoot at a whole group of the unit. So that I'm fine with. You also can set your battle time limit, and this only applies when you're the defensive side. So if you're getting attacked, or if you're attacking a settlement, the defender always can win or draw if they hold out until this set amount of time. Or you can set it to no limit, and they can never just hold out for a tie. They have to either beat you down or get killed themselves. And that applies to the defenders when you're attacking them, or when you're the defender getting attacked. I typically just set it in the 40 minutes mark. It gives me a little bit of time pressure when sieging, so I can't just take it slow and bring them down. And also it allows for certain draws, or sometime when the AI is attacking one of my settlements and I'm defending it by looping them around, which is quite a cheese in my opinion. It's better to have a time limit because I can kill them all if there's no time limit, but it just drags on the battle way too long and it will take a long time to kill them all. So 40 minutes is just a good neutral point, and that's what I'm sticking with. I think the default's actually 60 minutes, so you can play around with this. You can autosave to the cloud. This is also something I will talk about. On legendary campaign difficulty, you cannot manual save. The game will autosave after certain events, like a battle, or like a diplomatic deal, or like at end of the turn. And that's the only time you get to save. And it will rewrite the previous save, so you cannot load. And that's also part of the difficulty of playing a legendary. So if you don't like that, play on very hard. And you can also set it to autosave to the cloud, so you can get this game if you're playing through multiple systems and you want to load up the same save file on different systems. You can also check the option for timeless characters. This is a new option on patch 1.6.0, which will hide all the ages of the characters and no one will die by old age. Now, I'm not playing with this because it just feels a little unrealistic to me, playing a historical game where everyone doesn't die by old age, but some people prefer the roster of unique units in the game and don't want to see them die of old age, so they have this checked. So instead of seeing age, you will see the turns they have been alive in the game. And for some of the mechanics revolving kids growing up in the game, you will still see their age before they come of age at 18 years old or 16 years old, depending on which DLC you're playing. In most of the game, it's 18 years old, but for Mandate of Heaven, 16. You'll see their age until they come of age, and then it will change into a turn, a live number, just so that you can see it. Character will still die from battle or scripted events in the game, but you basically won't have them die of natural causes, which is a mortality roll, basically. Once your character reaches the age of 60, there will be a roll at the beginning of each turn, a very small percentage chance of death that will increase once you move on to your 70s, and then so forth. Now, some characters have what's called old age program into them because historically they went on to live quite a long time, and their mortality roll will start at age 70. So those characters tend to live longer because they have no chance to die of old age from 60 to 70, and they will get the 60 mortality rate once they kick off their 70s, so you can expect them to see reaching 80 sometimes. And you can once again reset the visor help here. You can also see AI player movement during your end turn. So this is something that I have changed over my experience. So in the beginning, I have it on, I think, full, so I can see what the AIs are doing during your end turn. You can visually see how they move their armies, if any army goes into ambush mode, and that's the key thing why I have it off now, because it makes the game slightly more difficult that you don't get to see what the AIs are doing and you just basically get to your next turn. It also speeds up your game quite a bit if you don't have this on. And time of day is basically there is a day-night cycle in the game. You can have it always morning, always day, always evening, always night, or real time, matching what time it is in real life, or have it go slower or faster. I'm just gonna stick it on default, not a big deal. And aside from that, we have one more big thing in romance mode or records mode. And this is a very hotly debated setting in Total War 3 Kingdom. The Total War 3 Kingdom is based on the historical event of the Three Kingdom, also on a novel called Romance of the Three Kingdom, which is a historical fictional work that is very popular in Chinese culture. It is named one of the 4 greatest classical literature works. And because of how famous it is and how widely read it is often considered canon, and even though it's quite ahistorical. And it covers the feats of these great generals who has done great deeds. If you play Dynasty Warriors, you know what I'm talking about. You basically can 1v100, 1v1000 with these great generals in the story. Now, clearly, historically, that did not happen, or sometime it did. In the case of Zhao Yun at Changban, he was actually 1v thousands trying to save his lord's son, but most of the story are fictional, and that's why it's depicted as a romance or a romanticized version of history. And the game does this by providing something that's a romance mode, in that your generals are single entity powerful warriors who have larger than life abilities that are inspired from their feats in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel. And it adds a layer of character versus character combat in that you can make characters duel, much like in the stories. And that's pretty much the difference versus Records mode, where generals become your typical Total War experience generals for most other Total War game, aside from Warhammer, which is also quite character focused. You pretty much have a historical general with a retinue of bodyguards as their unit. They are basically a cavalry unit that are slightly more powerful with some basic abilities that can inspire your troops. But aside from that, there's no real difference. The romance mode is much more popular in this game, typically because most players who are drawn to Total War Three Kingdoms are familiar with the story of Romance of the Three Kingdoms and prefer to play out their fantasy of their favorite generals becoming these single powerful warriors. And that's why I'm going to showcase it on romance mode as well. It's not meant for strategic balance, and it's not saying that record mode is more balanced, because it is not. You're fighting against the AI opponent. There's always going to be weaknesses with the AI that you can exploit. So it's not like record mode is much more strategic. It's just that you can do less stuff with your generals in records mode versus romance mode, where you can win the game with just generals if you really wanted to. It'll be really cheesy, but it's doable. But we'll be showcasing this on romance mode, and I highly recommend you trying out both if you want, just to feel the difference for yourself. But romance mode, I believe, is also default in the game. And with that said, we have finished covering all the setup, and we can jump into game, which will be the end of part 0 here. Please come back in part 1, as we'll showcase the game UI as well as some of the first things you should do before you start playing on turn 1. So I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial, and we'll see you all next time.